Richard Hartford had everything money could buy, except the one thing that mattered. His mother was dying, not from disease, but from something no doctor could diagnose. Then a woman making $12 an hour walked into his mansion and performed what seemed like magic, except it wasn't magic at all. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for the love and support. You're truly appreciated, and I'm so grateful to have you here with me. Richard Hartford's Mercedes glided through the iron gates of his Brentwood estate at exactly 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would split his life into before and after. The house rose before him like a monument to everything he'd achieved. 8 bedrooms, imported Italian marble, a staff of 6. But as he stepped through the mahogany doors, something felt wrong. The silence was different. Not the peaceful quiet of a well-run household, but something heavier. Something that pressed against his chest as he handed his briefcase to Marcus, the house manager, whose face carried an expression Richard had never seen before. Worry, maybe, or pity. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice carefully modulated, "Dr. Peterson has been here twice today. Your mother." Richard was already moving, his Italian leather shoes clicking across the marble foyer, through the great room with its vaulted ceilings and $10,000 chandelier, toward the east wing where his mother's suite occupied the entire second floor. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Dorothy Hartford's room was a shrine to comfort and care. The hospital bed, top of the line, imported from Germany, was positioned to catch the afternoon light. Medical monitors beeped softly, tracking vitals that meant nothing and everything. An IV stand stood sentinel beside the bed, its clear tubes running down to the woman who had once commanded every room she entered. But the woman in that bed wasn't his mother. Oh, it looked like her. Same silver hair, same fine bone structure, same delicate hands that had once wielded such decisive power in boardrooms and charity galas. But Dorothy Hartford, the woman who had built a real estate empire from nothing, who had raised Richard alone after his father's death, who had never taken no for an answer in her entire 78 years, was gone. In her place lay a husk, eyes open but unseeing, staring at the ceiling with an emptiness that made Richard's throat constrict. Her hands lay motionless on the silk sheets. She didn't turn when he entered, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. "Mom," his voice cracked on the single syllable. "Nothing." Dr. Peterson emerged from the bathroom, her expression professionally sympathetic. She was the 3rd specialist Richard had hired in as many weeks, recommended by the chief of medicine at Cedars-Sinai. Her credentials were impeccable. Her confusion was total. "Mr. Hartford, I've reviewed all the tests again." She pulled up charts on her tablet showing him numbers that meant nothing to him. "Physically, your mother is stable. Her blood work is normal. Brain scans show no anomalies. There's no infection, no tumor, no neurological explanation for this decline." "Then why?" Richard gestured helplessly at the bed, at the stranger wearing his mother's face. "I don't know." The doctor's admission hung in the air like an indictment. "Depression can manifest physically in elderly patients, but this is beyond anything I've seen. She's not responding to medication. She barely eats, doesn't speak. It's as if she's chosen to withdraw." Richard moved to his mother's bedside, lowering himself into the chair that had become his nightly vigil. He took her hand, so light now, so fragile, and felt nothing in return. No squeeze, no recognition. "Mom, it's Richard, I'm here, can you hear me?" Dorothy's eyes didn't even flicker. He'd first noticed the change 6 weeks ago, shortly after Dorothy's fall. It hadn't been serious, a stumble in the garden, a bruised hip, nothing broken. But she'd needed more help after that, and Richard, always solving problems with resources, had hired the best care team money could buy. Private nurses rotating in 8-hour shifts, physical therapists, a nutritionist, Dr. Peterson on call 24/7. At first, Dorothy had simply seemed tired, quieter than usual. Richard told himself it was natural, she was recovering after all, she needed rest. The medical team agreed, everything was under control. But then she stopped talking during their dinners together, stopped asking about his business, Stopped doing the crossword puzzles she'd completed every morning for 50 years. The light in her eyes began to dim, like someone was slowly turning down the brightness on a screen. 2 weeks ago, she'd stopped speaking entirely. 1 week ago, she'd stopped eating solid foods. 3 days ago, she'd stopped making eye contact. And today, when Richard had cut short his San Francisco trip to rush home, he'd found her like this, present but absent, breathing but not alive. "We could try moving her to a facility," Dr. Peterson suggested gently. "Somewhere with more resources, more specialized staff." "No," Richard's voice was sharp. "She stays here in her home. Whatever she needs, we get it for her, whatever it costs." But even as he said it, the hollowness of the words echoed in his chest. He'd been saying that for weeks, throwing money at the problem, hearing experts, installing equipment. And his mother kept fatting anyway, slipping away to somewhere he couldn't follow, couldn't buy his way into. The nurse for the evening shift arrived, Teresa, efficient and kind, who'd been with them for 3 weeks. She performed her duties with practiced compassion, checking vitals, adjusting pillows, speaking softly to Dorothy even though Dorothy never responded. Richard watched, feeling useless, feeling like a spectator in his own mother's life. "Has she had anything to eat today?" he asked. "Half a cup of broth at lunch," Teresa reported, consulting her notes. "She wouldn't take more. I tried the soup she used to like, but she just turned her head away." Richard stayed in that chair for 3 hours, holding his mother's hand, talking to her about nothing and everything. He told her about the San Francisco deal, about the new building going up downtown, about the morning he'd seen a sunrise that reminded him of the ones they'd watched together when he was young. He talked until his voice was hoarse, desperate for any sign that she heard him, that some part of her was still in there. Nothing. At 10 p.m., Teresa gently suggested he get some rest. Richard left his mother's room feeling like he was abandoning a sinking ship, even though a trained professional would be watching her all night. He walked through his palatial home, past the home theater he'd never used, the wine cellar stocked with bottles worth more than most people's cars, the art collection that had been featured in Architectural Digest, and felt the weight of every expensive, meaningless object. In his study, Richard poured himself 3 fingers of scotch and stood at the window, looking out over the grounds. The pool lights cast blue reflections across the water. The garden where his mother used to spend hours tending her roses was perfectly maintained by the landscaping crew. Everything was beautiful. Everything was in order. And his mother was dying in a room full of machines and medical professionals who couldn't explain why. He thought about calling his ex-wife, Sarah, but they'd been divorced for 5 years and she'd made it clear she wanted nothing to do with his family drama. He thought about calling his business partner, but what could Tom possibly say? He thought about calling the office, checking on tomorrow's meetings, but the very idea made him nauseous. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Hartford didn't know what to do. Money couldn't fix this. Power couldn't fix this. All his success, all his connections, all the resources he'd accumulated, none of it mattered. His mother was slipping away and he was helpless. He drank the scotch, poured another, stood at that window until the bottle was half empty and the grounds were dark, and somewhere in the house, his mother lay in her expensive bed, surrounded by expensive equipment, cared for by expensive professionals, dying of something that had nothing to do with disease. The next morning, Richard woke with a pounding headache and a phone full of missed calls from the office. He ignored them all and went straight to his mother's room. The day nurse, Catherine, competent and cheerful in a way that felt obscene given the circumstances, greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Any change?" Richard asked, though he could already see the answer. "She had some juice this morning, 2 sips. 2 sips. His mother, who used to host dinner parties for 30, who used to run a company, who used to fill rooms with her laughter and her presence, had managed 2 sips of juice. Richard spent the day working from his mother's bedside, laptop balanced on his knees, taking calls with his mother's labored breathing as background noise. Between meetings, he researched obsessively. Depression in elderly patients, failure to thrive, psychosomatic conditions, online forums full of people with similar stories, most of which ended badly. By evening, he'd made 17 phone calls to different specialists. By midnight, he'd scheduled consultations with 2 more doctors, both flown in from out of state. By 2 a.m., he was sitting in that chair again, holding his mother's hand, whispering into the darkness, "Please don't leave me. I don't know how to do this without you." Dorothy didn't respond. She never did anymore. What Richard didn't know, what none of the specialists or nurses or medical professionals could have told him, was that the answer to his mother's condition wasn't in any medical journal or prescription. It wasn't in the IV fluids or the monitors or the perfectly calibrated care plan. The answer was going to arrive in 2 days, carrying a mop and a bucket, speaking with an accent, earning $15 an hour. But before that could happen, Dorothy Hartford had to survive 2 more days of fatting, 2 more days of excellent care that somehow made everything worse, 2 more days of her son's desperate, helpless presence and his complete, terrible absence. The house settled into darkness. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and somewhere in the space between being alive and being gone, Dorothy Hartford waited for something she couldn't name, something she'd lost, something that no amount of money or expertise could provide. She waited for someone to see her. Maria Delgado stood on the sidewalk outside the Hartford estate, staring up at a house that belonged in a magazine. Or a movie. Certainly not in the same reality as her 2-bedroom apartment in East Los Angeles, where she lived with her daughter and grandson in a building where the elevator had been broken for 3 months. The text from the cleaning agency had come at 7 a.m., emergency placement. Brentwood Estate, 2-week assignment, maybe longer, high pay, discreet clientele, can you be there by 9? Maria had replied yes before checking the address. She needed the work. Her daughter Alina's hours at the hospital had been cut, and her grandson Miguel's asthma medication cost $200 a month even with insurance. You didn't say no to high-paying jobs, not when you were 53 years old with limited English and a resume that listed housekeeper as your only skill for 35 years. But now, looking at the iron gates and the house beyond, Maria felt her stomach twist. She'd cleaned houses in nice neighborhoods before. She'd worked for wealthy families. But this was different. This was the kind of wealth that made you invisible just by standing near it. The intercom crackled when she pressed the button. A professional voice, male, vaguely British, asked her business. She gave her name, the agency's name, stumbled over the English words. The gates swung open with a mechanical whisper that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Marcus met her at the door, his expression polite and assessing. He showed her where to put her things, explained the household routine in a voice that suggested he'd given this speech many times before. Maria nodded, understanding about half of what he said, filling in the rest with context and 35 years of experience reading what wealthy people wanted without them having to spell it out. The usual housekeeper is on family leave, Marcus explained, leading her through rooms that seemed to multiply as they walked. You'll be responsible for the main living areas, the kitchen, Mr. Hartford's study, and he paused at the base of a curved staircase. Mrs. Hartford's suite. Something in his tone made Maria look up sharply. Mrs. Hartford is unwell, Marcus continued carefully. There's a medical team caring for her, of course. You're just to maintain the space, clean around the equipment, don't disturb anything medical, and, another pause, she doesn't speak, don't be alarmed. Maria had cleaned houses for sick people before, hospice situations, recovery rooms, spaces where illness hung in the air like humidity. She nodded, keeping her face neutral, and followed Marcus up the stairs. The east wing was different from the rest of the house. Quieter. The air felt thicker somehow. Medical equipment lined the hallways, oxygen tanks, carts full of supplies with labels Maria couldn't read. A nurse sat at a small desk, looking at her phone. She glanced up when they passed, offered a professional smile that didn't invite conversation. Mrs. Hartford's suite, Marcus announced, opening double doors onto a room that made Maria stop breathing for a moment. It was beautiful, everything cream and gold and soft light, the kind of room you saw in magazines at the checkout line at the grocery store. But beauty didn't hide the truth. This was a sick room, the hospital bed, the monitors, the IV stand, the table covered in prescription bottles and medical supplies. And in the bed, so small she almost disappeared into the expensive linens, lay an old woman. Dorothy Hartford looked like something carved from wax. Her silver hair was perfectly brushed. Someone had been caring for her appearance at least, but her face was empty of everything that made a face human. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. Her hands lay on top of the covers, so still they might have been painted there. Maria had seen this before. Not in houses this expensive, but she'd seen it. Her own grandmother at the end. Her neighbor's husband, after the stroke that left his body working but his spirit gone. She knew what she was looking at. This woman was still breathing, but some essential part of her had already left. Just dust vacuum, change the linens on Tuesdays and Fridays, Marcus instructed, already backing toward the door as if he couldn't wait to leave this room. The nurses handle everything else. Don't bother Mrs. Hartford, she won't know you're there anyway. Then he was gone, and Maria was alone with the woman in the bed, and the soft beeping of machines counting heartbeats that didn't seem to mean anything anymore. For a long moment, Maria just stood there, her cleaning supplies in hand, looking at Dorothy Hartford. The old woman didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge Maria's presence at all. Don't bother her, Marcus had said. She won't know you're there. But Maria had been invisible her whole life. She knew what it felt like to be looked through, looked past, looked around. She knew what it was to be in a room and have people talk as if you weren't there, make decisions about your work without asking your opinion, discuss your presence in the third person while you stood 3 feet away. She knew what it was to be treated as furniture, as a tool, as a function rather than a person. And something about the emptiness in Dorothy Hartford's eyes, the absolute absence of connection, made Maria's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with her own problems. She set down her supplies, approached the bed slowly, the way you'd approach a frightened animal, and then in Spanish, because English always felt awkward in her mouth and this didn't feel like a moment for performance, Maria said softly, "Buenos dias, señora. My name is Maria. I'm going to clean your room now if that's okay. I'll try not to disturb you." Dorothy's eyes didn't move, but Maria hadn't expected them to. She worked quietly, efficiently, the way she'd been taught by her own mother who'd cleaned houses before her. Started with the surfaces farthest from the bed, worked her way closer. Dusted the expensive furniture, vacuumed the expensive carpet, straightened the expensive curtains. Every few minutes she'd glance at Dorothy, checking for any sign of distress. Nothing. The old woman lay there like a statue, like she'd already moved on to wherever people went when they gave up on the world. After 40 minutes, Maria finished the visible cleaning, but something kept her from leaving. Some instinct honed over decades of reading rooms and situations told her this wasn't done. She approached the bed again, looked at Dorothy, really looked, the way you look at a person and not a problem or a task. The room was perfect, clean, organized, all the medical equipment precisely positioned, everything in its place. It looked exactly like what it was, a very expensive room where someone was dying very slowly. It looked like nowhere anyone would want to be. Maria thought about her own grandmother. In those last weeks, not in a room like this, they'd had nothing like this, but in the small bedroom she'd shared with Maria's aunt, surrounded by family photos and her rosary, and the radio always tuned to the Mexican station that played the old songs. Surrounded by noise and life and people who weren't afraid to sit close, to hold her hand, to cry where she could see them. Her grandmother had died in the end, but she died knowing she was loved, knowing she was seen, knowing that her presence mattered right up until her last breath. This woman, this rich, isolated woman in this perfect, sterile room, didn't have any of that. Maria looked at the window, heavy curtains drawn, blocking out the California sunshine. She walked over and pulled them open. Light flooded the room, making the medical equipment look even more intrusive, but also revealing the view beyond. A garden, lush and green, flowers blooming in colors that seemed impossible. "Look at that, señora," Maria said softly in Spanish, even though she knew Dorothy couldn't understand her. "What beautiful roses. Do you like roses?" No response, but Maria thought, maybe imagined, that Dorothy's eyes shifted slightly toward the window, just a fraction, just for a second. It was probably nothing, but Maria had spent her whole life reading tiny signals, interpreting the smallest cues from employers who expected her to anticipate their needs without asking. She'd learned to see what others missed. And she could have sworn Dorothy's eyes had moved. Maria checked her watch. She was supposed to move on to the other rooms, finish the downstairs before lunch. But something held her there, standing at that window, looking between the garden and the woman in the bed. "You know," Maria said, continuing in Spanish because it felt right, because it felt honest, "my grandmother used to have a garden. Nothing like yours, just a little patch behind her house. But she loved it. Said plants taught you about life, about patience, about how something could look dead all winter and then come back in the spring if you just gave it time and care and believed it was still in there, waiting." She turned from the window, studying Dorothy's profile. Still nothing. But Maria wasn't discouraged. She'd raised 3 children, taken care of her grandmother, helped Alina through Miguel's difficult infancy. She knew that presence mattered even when there was no visible response. Sometimes especially then. "I'll come back tomorrow, Senora," Maria said, moving toward the door. "We'll open these curtains again, let you see your garden." She gathered her supplies and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. In the bed, Dorothy Hartford's finger twitched, just once, just barely, so slightly that no monitor could have caught it, no medical professional would have noticed. But it moved. Richard was on a conference call when he heard something that made him mute his microphone mid-sentence. Music. Not the classical pieces that played softly through the house's sound system, not the television or radio from one of the staff areas. This was different, older, scratchy with age. And it was coming from his mother's room. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't quite hope either. At the door to his mother's suite, he froze. The sight that greeted him didn't make sense. Maria, the new housekeeper, he'd barely noticed her in the 3 days she'd been working, stood at the far side of the room with a phone in her hand. Music poured from the tiny speaker, some big band melody from the 1940s that Richard vaguely recognized from his childhood. The curtains were open wide, flooding the room with afternoon light. And his mother. His mother's head was turned toward the music. Not much, maybe just a few degrees. But Dorothy Hartford, who hadn't moved voluntarily in weeks, who hadn't acknowledged anything around her since Richard couldn't remember when, had turned her head toward the sound. Richard must have made some noise because Maria looked up, startled. She fumbled with the phone, cutting off the music, her face flushing with what looked like guilt. "I'm sorry, senor," she said quickly, her English heavily accented but clear enough. I thought maybe I should not have." "What were you doing?" Richard's voice came out harsher than he intended. Maria clutched her phone, looking between Richard and Dorothy like a child caught doing something forbidden. "I was talking to her, to your mother, and I remembered, my grandmother, she loved the old music. Even at the end when she didn't talk anymore, music made her. I thought maybe." She trailed off, but Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at his mother. Dorothy's head had slowly turned back toward the ceiling, but her hand, her left hand, which had been motionless for weeks, was moving. Just the fingers, just slightly, tapping a rhythm against the sheets that matched the phantom echo of the music that had just stopped. "How long have you been doing this?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Today is the first time with music," Maria admitted. "But I've been talking to her, opening the curtains, telling her about the garden, small things. I know I should just clean, but I thought." "Keep doing it." Richard surprised himself with the command. "Whatever you've been doing, keep doing it." Maria nodded, looking uncertain but willing. Richard approached his mother's bed slowly, hardly daring to hope. "Mom, can you hear me? Did you like the music?" Dorothy's eyes didn't move toward him, but her fingers kept tapping that slow rhythm, and Richard felt something crack open in his chest that he'd been keeping tightly sealed for weeks. Over the next few days, Richard found himself making excuses to be home more, cutting meetings short, delegating responsibilities he'd never trusted anyone else to handle, always timing his returns to coincide with Maria's shifts. He watched her from the doorway, this cleaning woman who'd somehow become more than that. She'd arrive in Dorothy's room with her supplies, but cleaning was becoming secondary to something else, something Richard didn't have a name for. Maria talked, constantly, not in English. Her Spanish flowed more naturally, more honestly, but Richard could hear the tone, the warmth, the way she spoke to his mother like a person instead of a patient. She described the weather outside, the flowers in the garden, the birds at the feeder. She told stories. Richard pieced together fragments about her life, her grandmother, her daughter who worked at a hospital, her grandson who loved dinosaurs. She asked Dorothy questions, never expecting answers but asking anyway, as if the conversation mattered even when it was one-sided. And slowly, impossibly slowly but definitively, Dorothy began to respond. Not with words, not yet, but her eyes would track Maria's movement across the room. Her head would turn when Maria entered. Her fingers would move more frequently, reaching toward things, trying to gesture in ways that had meaning even if no one else could interpret them. The day shift nurse, Catherine, pulled Richard aside during one of his vigils. "I don't understand it," she said, her professional confusion evident. "Her vitals haven't changed. The medication is the same, but there's something different. She's more present, alert. It started about a week ago." A week ago, right when Maria had started. "The new housekeeper," Richard said, realization dawning. "Maria, she's been spending time with her." Catherine frowned. "The cleaning lady, but she's not trained in." "I don't care," Richard cut her off. "Whatever she's doing, it's working better than anything we've tried." He found Maria in the kitchen during her lunch break, eating something she'd brought from home wrapped in foil. She looked up when he entered, immediately starting to stand, but he waved her back down. "Sit, please, I want to ask you something." Maria sat, but she looked uncomfortable, like she was calculating whether this conversation would cost her the job. "My mother," Richard began, then stopped, not sure how to articulate what he wanted to know. "What do you talk to her about? What do you do differently?" Maria was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I don't do anything special, senor. I treat her like she's there, like she matters, like she's not just a body that needs care but a person who needs to be seen." "Seen?" Richard repeated. "Yes." Maria's hands moved as she tried to explain, her English becoming more fractured as she struggled with the concept. "When I clean, many people, they don't see me. I am just the cleaning lady. I am part of the furniture, and I think maybe your mother, she feels like that too. Everyone sees the sick woman, the patient, the problem that needs solving, but nobody sees Dorothy." The use of his mother's name, casual, familiar, human, hit Richard like a physical blow. "So I talk to her like she's Dorothy," Maria continued. "I tell her about my day, I ask what she thinks about things, I play her music, I open the curtain so she can see the life outside, small things, but things that say you are here, you exist, you matter." Richard had to look away, suddenly unable to meet Maria's eyes, because in her simple explanation, she'd exposed something he'd been desperately trying not to acknowledge. He'd been doing exactly what Maria described, seeing the problem, not the person, seeing his mother as something to be fixed, managed, treated. He'd hired professionals, bought equipment, consulted specialists. He'd thrown every resource at her care. But when was the last time he just sat with her? Really sat, not checking his phone, not thinking about work, not cataloging symptoms and strategies. When was the last time he talked to her about something other than her health, asked her opinion, shared a memory, treated her like the woman who'd raised him instead of a patient who needed managing? "Senor," Maria's voice was gentle, "are you okay?" "I've been outsourcing my mother's care," Richard said, the words tasting like ash. I thought I was helping, giving her the best, but I was making her disappear." "You love her," Maria said simply. "Sometimes when we love someone, we try too hard to save them and forget to just be with them." That afternoon, Richard did something he hadn't done in months. He pulled a chair up to his mother's bedside, sent his assistant a message to cancel everything for the rest of the day, and just sat. "Hey, Mom," he began, his voice rough. "I want to tell you about something that happened this morning, something that made me think of you." He talked about a sunrise he'd seen, about a deal that had fallen through and how angry he'd been, until he realized it didn't matter as much as he'd thought. About Sarah calling out of the blue to ask about Dorothy. About meaningless, human things that had nothing to do with symptoms or treatments. And as he talked, Dorothy's eyes slowly, so slowly he almost missed it, moved from the ceiling toward his face. The breath caught in Richard's throat. "Mom." Her lips moved, just barely, forming sounds that weren't quite words but weren't quite silence either. Richard leaned closer. "I'm here, I'm listening, what do you need?" Dorothy's hand shifted on the covers, reaching, not toward the water glass or the call button or any of the medical equipment, reaching toward him. Richard took her hand, and for the first time in weeks, he felt her fingers squeeze back. He sat there, holding his mother's hand, tears streaming down his face, while afternoon light flooded the room, and somewhere downstairs Maria was humming one of those old songs as she cleaned. And Dorothy Hartford's eyes stayed open and focused and present in a way they hadn't been since this nightmare began. The next morning, Richard came down to breakfast to find Maria had already opened the curtains in every room on the first floor. Sunshine poured through the house, making everything look different, warmer, more alive. He found her in his mother's room, and he stopped in the doorway at the scene before him. Maria had pulled the guest chair close to the bed. She was showing Dorothy something on her phone, photos, Richard realized. Pictures of a little boy making faces at the camera. "This is my Miguel," Maria was saying in Spanish, not knowing Richard was there. "He's 7, very smart, very silly. He wants to be a paleontologist when he grows up. Do you know what that is, Senora? Someone who studies dinosaurs." She swiped to another photo. "Here, he dressed up as a T-Rex for Halloween. He made the costume himself with my daughter's help. Looked so funny when he tried to eat dinner with those little arms." And then, impossibly, miraculously, Dorothy laughed. Not a full laugh, more like a breath that carried sound, but it was there, unmistakable, the first voluntary sound she'd made in a month. Maria looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She saw Richard in the doorway and smiled. "She likes Miguel, I knew she would." Richard nodded, not trusting his voice. He watched Maria continue showing photos, narrating each one, treating his mother like an old friend catching up rather than a patient requiring professional distance. And Dorothy watched, really watched, present and engaged in a way that no medical intervention had achieved. That evening, after Maria had gone home and the night nurse had taken over, Richard sat with his mother in the golden light of sunset. Dorothy was tired. He could see it in the lines around her eyes, but she was there, conscious, aware. "Mom," he said softly, I'm sorry I wasn't. I'm sorry I didn't." Dorothy's hand moved on his, squeezed gently. Her lips moved, and this time sound came out, rough, barely audible, but words. "Not your fault." 3 words, but they were everything. Richard leaned forward, pressing his forehead against their joined hands, and let himself cry in a way he hadn't since he was a child, and Dorothy Hartford was the only person in the world who could make everything okay. Outside, the garden was in bloom. Inside, something that had been dying was slowly coming back to life. And somewhere between those two truths, Richard Hartford began to understand what his mother had needed all along. Not medicine, not expertise, not the best care money could buy. Just someone to see her, to sit with her, to remind her that she still existed as a person, not a patient, that her life still mattered, that she wasn't alone. Maria had given his mother that gift, and in doing so, she'd shown Richard exactly how far he'd strayed from the person his mother had raised him to be. Tomorrow, he would cancel his morning meetings. He would sit with his mother and ask her about her life, her memories, her thoughts. He would treat her like the remarkable woman she was instead of the problem he needed to solve. But tonight, he just held her hand and watched the sunset paint the walls gold, and listened to his mother breathe, and felt grateful for every moment she was still here, still present, still his mother. Still Dorothy. 3 weeks after Maria first walked through the Hartford estate's gates, Dorothy spoke her first full sentence. "I want to go to the garden." She said it during breakfast, actual breakfast, oatmeal with honey that she'd eaten herself, slowly but deliberately, while Maria sat beside her describing the morning fog rolling over the hills. The words came out rough and quiet, but perfectly clear. Richard, who'd been working on his laptop at the small table in his mother's suite, nearly dropped his coffee. Maria's face lit up like someone had turned on a light inside her. "Senora, yes, the garden is beautiful today. The roses are blooming." Catherine, the day nurse, immediately went into professional mode. "Mrs. Hartford, I'm not sure that's advisable. You've been bedbound for." "I want to go to the garden." Dorothy's voice was stronger this time, stubborn. Richard recognized that tone from his childhood, from every battle his mother had fought and won through sheer force of will. I'm not asking permission. Richard closed his laptop. Then let's go to the garden. It took 45 minutes to get Dorothy ready. The wheelchair, ordered weeks ago when hope was still just a word, gathering dust in a closet, had to be retrieved and cleaned. Dorothy needed help dressing in actual clothes instead of the hospital gowns she'd been wearing. Catherine insisted on bringing emergency medical supplies, just in case. But finally, with Maria on one side and Richard on the other, Dorothy settled into the wheelchair. She was fragile, yes, weak from weeks of barely eating, barely moving. But her eyes were alert and focused in a way that made Richard's chest ache with something between joy and grief. They took the elevator to the first floor. Richard had forgotten they even had an elevator, installed years ago when he'd bought the house, never used, and wheeled Dorothy through the great room toward the French doors that led to the garden. The moment they crossed the threshold, Dorothy closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sun. Oh, she breathed just that, but it carried the weight of a prayer. Maria wheeled her slowly down the stone path, between the flower beds that the landscaping company maintained in perfect order. Dorothy reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the petals of a yellow rose. Gently, like greeting an old friend. "They've been taking care of them," she murmured. "My roses." "They're beautiful, Mom," Richard said, crouching beside the wheelchair. "Just like you always kept them." Dorothy's eyes met his, and in them Richard saw something he hadn't seen in months: sharpness, clarity. The woman who'd built an empire, raised a son, survived loss and hardship, and every challenge life had thrown at her. "They're perfect," Dorothy said softly, "professionally maintained, expertly trimmed, fertilized on schedule." She paused, her finger still on the rose petal. "But I don't know any of them anymore." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, because he understood exactly what she meant. The garden was beautiful, yes, maintained to perfection, but it wasn't her garden. She hadn't touched the soil, hadn't chosen the plantings, hadn't made the decisions about where things grew and how they were shaped. It was beautiful, but it wasn't hers. Just like the care she'd been receiving, perfect, professional, expert, but somehow completely wrong. "Senora," Maria said gently, kneeling beside the wheelchair, "would you like to plant something, something new that would be yours?" Dorothy looked at her, and something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, the kind of communication that happened without words. "Yes," Dorothy said, "I would like that very much." They spent an hour in that garden. Maria ran to a nearby nursery and came back with herbs in small pots, basil and rosemary and thyme, and a bag of potting soil. Under Dorothy's direction, they created a small container garden on the patio table, Dorothy's shaking hands pressing seeds into the earth, getting soil under her fingernails, choosing where each plant should go. Richard watched his mother come alive with each decision, each small act of creation. This was what had been missing, not just being in the world but participating in it, making choices, having agency, mattering. "I've been so angry," Dorothy said suddenly, her hands paused in the dirt. Richard exchanged a glance with Maria. "Angry about what, Mom?" "At all of you." Dorothy's voice was matter-of-fact, not accusatory. "At the nurses and doctors who handled me like a delicate piece of equipment. At you for hearing them and then disappearing into your work. At myself for letting it happen, for giving up." "Mom, you were sick." "I was lonely." Dorothy cut him off, her eyes still on the herbs she was planting. "That's different from sick, Richard. You can be healthy and lonely. You can be cared for and lonely. You can have every resource in the world and still be desperately, devastatingly alone." The words hung in the air. Catherine had the grace to quietly step away, giving them privacy. "After my fall," Dorothy continued, "I was scared. And you responded by turning my life into a hospital, private nurses, medical equipment, monitoring, everything scheduled and managed and controlled. And I understood why you were scared too. But somewhere in all that care I stopped being your mother. I stopped being Dorothy. I became a patient. A problem to be solved. A body to be maintained." Richard felt tears on his face but didn't wipe them away. "I didn't know what else to do." "I know." Dorothy's hand found his, pressing gently. "You did what you thought was best. You always do. But Richard, love isn't about giving people the best of everything. Sometimes it's just about being there, being present, seeing them." "Like Maria does," Richard said. looking at the woman who'd somehow saved his mother by simply treating her like a person. Like Maria does, Dorothy agreed. She turned to Maria, who was crying openly now. Thank you, for seeing me when everyone else just saw a sick old woman, for talking to me like I still mattered, for remembering that I'm still here. Maria took Dorothy's hand, soil-stained fingers intertwining. You do matter, Senora, you matter so much. They stayed in the garden until Dorothy's energy began to flag. But even as they wheeled her back inside, she was different. The emptiness in her eyes was gone, replaced by something fierce and alive. Over the following weeks, Dorothy's transformation continued. Not miraculously, she was still fragile, still needed help with basic tasks, still tired easily. But she was present, engaged, alive in all the ways that mattered. The medical team gradually scaled back. The hospital bed was replaced with a regular bed. The monitors were removed. Dorothy still had nurses, but fewer of them, and their roles shifted from medical oversight to companionship and assistance. And Maria, who'd been hired as temporary help, became something else entirely. Richard found them together most days, talking in a mix of English and Spanish and hand gestures, showing each other photos, laughing at private jokes. Maria brought her grandson Miguel to visit, and Dorothy lit up at his dinosaur enthusiast chatter. Dorothy shared stories from her own childhood, her early days building her business, memories of Richard's father that Richard had never heard before. They weren't employer and employee anymore. They were something closer to friends or family. One afternoon, 6 weeks after that first trip to the garden, Richard came home to find his mother sitting in the sunroom, actually sitting, in a regular chair, not a wheelchair, with Maria beside her. They were going through old photo albums, Dorothy narrating each picture while Maria listened with genuine interest. And this one, Dorothy was saying, pointing to a faded photograph. This was the day we opened our first office. We didn't have proper furniture yet, just some desks we'd bought at a yard sale. But we felt like we owned the world. You were so beautiful, Senora, Maria said. So strong. Dorothy raised an eyebrow and both women laughed. Richard stood in the doorway just watching. His mother looked good. Not young, the weeks of decline had left their mark and she'd probably never fully recover her earlier strength. But she looked alive, present, like herself. Richard, Dorothy called out, spotting him. Come here, I want to talk to you. He approached, suddenly nervous. Dorothy had been gentle with him since her recovery began, but he knew there were conversations they still needed to have, truths that needed acknowledging. Sit, Dorothy commanded, and Richard sat. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, her expression serious. I want you to understand something. What happened to me, the decline, the withdrawal, that wasn't entirely your fault. I made choices too. I chose to give up. I chose to stop fighting, and I need to own that. But let me finish. Dorothy's voice was firm but kind. You did make mistakes. You tried to buy your way out of a problem that money couldn't fix. You hired people to care for me so you wouldn't have to do it yourself. You treated my life like a business problem that needed professional management. All of that is true. Richard nodded, unable to speak. But I also let you, Dorothy continued. I let you hide behind the medical team. I let you outsource the hard parts of caring for me. I stopped demanding your presence because it was easier than confronting how much we drifted apart. We both failed each other, Richard, and we both get a chance to do better. I want to do better, Richard said, his voice thick. I want to be here, really here, not just physically present but actually engaged, with you, with life. I've been so focused on building and acquiring and succeeding that I forgot what any of it was for. Dorothy reached out and cupped his face, the way she'd done when he was a child. Then let's start over, both of us. We'll figure out what this next chapter looks like together. Maria quietly stood to leave, but Dorothy caught her hand. Stay, you're part of this conversation too. Senora, You're not just anything, Dorothy cut her off gently. You saved my life, Maria, not by being a medical professional or following some treatment plan. You saved me by seeing me, by reminding me that I was still here, still mattered, still had value as a person. That's not just cleaning. That's not just a job. That's grace. Maria's eyes filled with tears. I only did what anyone should do, what felt right. But most people don't, Richard said, understanding flooding through him. Most people, including me, don't know how to just be with someone. We're so busy doing, fixing, managing that we forget how to simply sit with another person and see them. You taught us that. You taught me too, Maria said softly. You taught me that I have value beyond my work, that my presence matters, that I have something to offer that isn't about how well I clean or how fast I work. The three of them sat there in the sunroom, afternoon light painting everything gold, and something shifted. They weren't client and housekeeper and son anymore. They were three people who'd found each other in a moment of crisis and somehow managed to create something real. That evening, Richard made a decision. He called his business partner and announced he was stepping back from day-to-day operations. Not retiring, Dorothy wouldn't want him to stop working entirely and truthfully. He still loved the challenge of business, but recalibrating, making room for life outside the office. What brought this on? Tom asked, confusion evident in his voice. Richard looked across the room at his mother, who was teaching Maria a card game, both of them laughing at some joke he'd missed. I remembered what matters, he said simply. The weeks turned into months. Dorothy continued to improve, not to her former strength but to something stable and sustainable. She still needed help with certain tasks, still tired more easily than before, but she was living rather than merely existing. She started hosting small gatherings again, not the elaborate parties of her earlier life, but intimate dinners with friends she'd neglected during her years of building and acquiring. Maria was always invited, always present, no longer as staff but as family. Richard cut his work hours in half, started eating dinner with his mother every night, learned to cook, badly but with enthusiasm, because Dorothy and Maria found his disasters hilarious, rediscovered hobbies he'd abandoned years ago, started dating again but differently this time, looking for connection rather than conquest. And Maria, who'd taken the Hartford job as temporary work, found herself offered something permanent. Not as a housekeeper, though she still kept the house running smoothly, but as something that didn't have a clear title. Companion. Friend. The person who reminded them all to be present, to see each other, to remember that life was happening right now, in this moment, not in some future achievement or past glory. 8 months after Dorothy's first trip to the garden, Richard found his mother and Maria there again, tending the herbs and vegetables that had become their shared project. Dorothy was showing Maria how to prune the rosemary, their hands working together in the soil. You know what I learned, Dorothy said, not to Richard but to Maria, though he could hear them from where he stood by the window. I learned that losing everything, my health, my independence, my purpose, taught me what I actually had. What's that, Senora? The capacity to start over. The ability to let go of who I was and discover who I am. The courage to accept help and the wisdom to recognize that needing people isn't weakness. It's the most human thing there is. Maria smiled. My grandmother used to say that life breaks everyone eventually, but some people grow stronger in the broken places. Your grandmother was wise. Like you, Senora. Dorothy laughed. I'm not wise. I'm just old enough to finally understand that control is an illusion. The only real power we have is in how we treat each other, how we show up, how we see people and let ourselves be seen. Richard turned from the window, his eyes wet. His mother was right. You could have everything, money, success, power, and still be desperately poor in the things that actually mattered. But you could also lose everything: health, independence, certainty, and discover riches you'd never known existed. That evening, the three of them ate dinner together in the garden, simple food, nothing fancy, but made with care and shared with love. They talked about everything and nothing, told stories, laughed, sat in comfortable silence as the sun set and the lights came on and the evening air filled with the scent of rosemary and roses. Dorothy looked at Richard across the table, her eyes clear and sharp and fully present. I'm glad I didn't die during those weeks, she said simply. Not because I was afraid of death, but because I would have missed this right here, this moment with you both, this second chance. Me too, Mom, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Me too. Maria reached across the table, taking both their hands. To second chances, she said softly, and to seeing each other. To seeing each other, they echoed. And in that garden, Surrounded by flowers Dorothy had planted with her own hands and herbs that Maria had chosen and lights that Richard had strung, because it made the space feel magical. Three people who'd found each other in the midst of crisis sat together as the stars came out. Not employer and employee and son, not patient and caregiver and family. Just three people who'd learned what it meant to truly see another human being, to be present, to show up with honesty and vulnerability and grace. Three people who discovered that the greatest wealth had nothing to do with money. It had to do with moments like this, shared and real and fully alive. The garden grew around them. The night settled in. And somewhere in that space between darkness and light, between loss and recovery, between who they'd been and who they were becoming, Dorothy Hartford smiled. She was here, she was seen, she mattered. And that finally was enough. What would you have done if you were Richard? If you had all the money in the world but couldn't save the person you loved most? Think about it for a second, because this story isn't just about one family, it's about all of us. We live in a world that tells us love means providing, protecting, fixing. We throw resources at problems, we hire experts, we manage and optimize and control. And somehow in all that doing we forget the simplest truth. Sometimes people don't need to be saved. They need to be seen. Dorothy was disappearing because everyone treated her like a patient instead of a person. Like a problem instead of a human being with stories and memories and value that had nothing to do with her productivity or her health. And it took a housekeeper making $15 an hour to recognize what a team of expensive specialists missed. Presence matters more than proficiency. Connection heals what medicine can't touch. How many people in your life are fatting right now because they feel invisible? How many times have you outsourced care instead of showing up yourself? How many moments have you missed because you were too busy solving problems to sit with the people who matter? This story should make you angry. Angry at a system that values efficiency over humanity, credentials over compassion, doing over being. But it should also give you hope. Because Maria proved that one person willing to see another human being, willing to show up with presence and dignity and simple human kindness, can change everything. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own priorities, your own definition of what it means to truly care for someone, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button if you believe presence matters more than presence. If you've ever felt invisible or known someone who was fatting because no one truly saw them anymore. Drop a comment below and tell me, I see you, 3 simple words. Because somewhere someone reading this needs to hear them. And let me know, have you ever been in Richard's position, or Dorothy's, or Maria's? Share your story. This community needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because every week I bring you stories like this. Stories about people who challenge systems, who choose connection over convenience, who prove that the most profound changes often come from the simplest acts of human decency. Don't miss a single one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. That parent who's been outsourcing care. That friend who's struggling to balance career and family. That person who feels invisible. This story might be exactly what shifts their perspective. We're building a community here. People who believe that human connection matters, that dignity isn't negotiable, that every person deserves to be seen regardless of their age, health, or productivity. People who understand that the greatest healing doesn't come from credentials or resources, but from simple, radical presence. You're not alone in feeling this. You're not alone in struggling with it. And together, we're going to keep sharing these stories, keep amplifying these truths, keep reminding each other what actually matters. So let me hear from you right now. Like, comment, subscribe, share. Because stories like Dorothy's, like Maria's, like Richard's, they need to be told. They need to be heard. They need to change how we see each other and how we show up in this world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for seeing. Now let's make sure everyone else does too.